Dismissiveness is a key theme in Angel at My Table, particularly, it seems to me, as it relates to the theme song, Duncan Gray by Robert Burns. The song is repeated at the beginning and end of the first and third episodes of the film, and in 4 other places at least within it. It usually has to do with someone being misportrayed or sent away, much like the original song does. It has a lot of meanings with respect to seeing someone through a narcissistic lens. One of the less talked about aspects of narcissism is dismissiveness, refusal to listen or acknowledge part of the other person's personality. As I talked a little bit about in the previous video, Janet Frame is someone in the book who seems to have both dominant and submissive elements to her personality. But in the film, the dominant ones are left out. She's not shown in leadership roles, which she had as a student. So this is what I would call a dismissive view of her character, where we're throwing out part of her personality and looking only at the other part. The opening scenes of the movie show her essentially being framed, which is a pun and a foreshadowing of what will happen in the movie, since she chooses the name Janet Frame out of other alternatives when she goes into adulthood. But we're shown her with her mother trying to screen her view of someone who has tics, who twitches uncontrollably and is standing in front of an asylum, and is mocked by her brother in the background, saying that's where the loonies go. This is ironic, of course, because her brother is later on mocked for having mental illness by his peers. And this is one of the scenes in which the background distorted version of the song Duncan Gray plays, with only the music playing. This is associated with being in pain and being dismissed by people, ignored or shunned, thrown away. It's also one that happens a little bit earlier when Janet makes her first attempt to ingratiate herself with her schoolmates, is disciplined by the teacher and is sent to the back of the room, and she makes this walk of shame, and a distorted version of the Duncan Gray song plays then as well. But when we're shown this initial version of the man who's called the loony, her mother, Janet Frame's mother, tries to shield her view by holding up her hands, but there's a gap between them. She puts them up against the window of the train, and Janet can easily look through the hands, so instead of blocking her view is framed. We are also given the same view from the outside, looking in at Janet as someone who is going to be framed in the course of the movie, by giving an aspect of her character that's smaller than and more limiting, and in some ways almost criminal compared to the aspect in the book. There is in the song an allusion to one lover saying to the other, essentially, get out of my sight or go to, well, a place in the underworld that's rather gloomy and not as nice as the one we're in. This has several meanings in the film. Also, in a current series called Lost Girl, Season 4, Episode 9, a similar joke is made by one of the supernatural beings, a British crow, who says if you touch this particular grave or step on it, you'll go to hell, which he equates with France, and saying that France and hell are essentially the same thing. And this is the same joke or expression that seems to me it's alluded to in the Duncan Gray song from Robbie Burns' time. Someone rejecting the lover and essentially saying, go to hell. And being accepted only after having made that gesture. So there's a rather unhealthy relationship, potentially, in the song Duncan Gray, in that someone who will take interest in the lover only after having been viciously spurned and discarded and dismissed. In the movie Angel at My Table, this happens or is hinted at in several ways. One is that the Hades, at least in Greek mythology, is a place where all color drains away. And this is what happens in the mental hospital when we see Janet. Even her bright red hair is not showing up as red when she's there. There's also, when she goes to London and France, a dreariness to the landscape and to the sky. In New Zealand, even though it's a very green, well-watered place, it's generally sunny and bright and heavenly even looking. Whereas in France and in England, the aspect of the landscape is dreary and foggy, much like the loss of color you'd expect in going to a dreary underworld. There is one version which I'd have to correct from my past video, one moment where Janet and her sisters all sing together. This has an otherworldly quality to it in that it's at the beginning of part 3 when two of her sisters have died by drowning, and they are singing facing out to sea, the very element that killed two of the girls. And they're singing somewhat defiantly the same verse, which has the key quote from Duncan Gray in it. So they seem to be addressing their mother country because they're using a song that came from Scotland, and they're of Scots descent living in New Zealand, an area that's called more British than Britain in some ways. But it's as if they've had to be wooed and spurn their mother country, it seems to me. They're sitting on the shore of their homeland, the island of New Zealand, facing back out toward the Pacific as if you'd have to look all the way across the Pacific and North America back toward Europe. And they're singing this song about rejecting someone in order to be accepted. This is what has to happen in Janet's life as well. She says she would die if she stayed in New Zealand because it's seen as very abnormal to be an artist. So in order to broaden her experience, she goes to a country where it's more normal to be an artist, in an island and in the Mediterranean. And she is not really accepted or wooed in the biological sense until she goes to Europe. Nobody wants to be her boyfriend until she's pursued by the English and the American living abroad, and not very satisfactorily even then. But that leads to two instances of the Duncan Gray song being played. One where she doesn't say goodbye to her boyfriend who hasn't been very honest with her about how long he's going to stay, and the song plays as he's leaving, so there's a dismissal going on there. And then later on when she has a miscarriage, there's the usual distorted sound of the melody that shows that someone is in pain, and so she's losing her baby at that point. And that's the Duncan song plays again there. But the Defiance plays through in that when you're someone, I presume, from a smaller colonial country in the British Empire, you aren't taken seriously as an artist until you're published, in her case, outside New Zealand, until you're vetted by the mother country where all the big major known artists have come from and where there's more history and more status to being an artist. She has to win the favor of this country that is not really worth winning, much like many of her lovers are. They don't recognize her and interact with her in a creative way. This is something that's absent from all the relationships when you have a dismissive culture and a dismissive way of looking at people. That there must either be master or slave, and that people don't create and then bounce ideas off each other that each result in more creation going back and forth. There is of course a torturing of truly creative people in this sort of culture, in that the others don't recognize that there is this way to interact with other people, not just being a dominant or a submissive, but being a creator. And the dismissiveness comes from first saying that there's no other way to interact, having these massively popular movies like Twilight and 50 Shades of Grey that are all about either being the prey or the predator and nothing in between. There's no singing in Twilight or 50 Shades of Grey. There aren't people who are truly artists in those either. And this is something that runs all the way through Angel at My Table and other films in which we are made to see people through this dismissive lens.